Good morning, everyone. We've got an hour scheduled for the call today. The topic, as you see, is data management and info security. In our announcement, we gave a brief overview of what it is. What we're going to do today is, and I'm going to do this live. So here's our agenda for today. Carol just provided the welcome. I'm going to do a quick overview of the topic, get into what I see and perceive as the goals and objectives, and forgive me for 1 second while I just shut down my email so it doesn't bother us. Okay, there we go. And then I'm going to open this up for discussion, capture notes live as we speak, and go through the other elements of the agenda, what we would like the group, or what the group feels their expected outcomes are, how we should function, operate, meetings, schedules, etc., and then next steps. For those of you who attended the call a couple of weeks ago, we found that to be an effective approach. Although we did eat up the hour pretty quickly, obviously there's going to be a lot of follow-up meetings to this, and we hope that the conversation is active and live. As Carol said, please participate, raise your hands, or send notes, and we'll try to accommodate everybody's comments. If we don't, no worries. We'll be having other meetings going forward, like I said. And if there is a point that you aren't able to provide, just send me an email to Carol. We'll make sure we capture them. The goal is to have these meetings every 3 weeks. Although my apologies, my travel schedule has been kind of crazy, so we may have to extend that a little bit to get us started. And once we get started, the cadence will be every 3 weeks. That's the goal. Mike, any comments before we kick in? You brought up a good example right before we started.
Well, just that I was a victim of fraud. My bank did detect the fraud on my card and did all the appropriate things. And what fell short, however, John, was a little bit of coordination in my bank across all of its various departments to stop the card, reissue a card, track my payments, refund my money. So I think we're certainly seeing, at least I'm seeing in real life, kind of one of the challenges that the bank has in coordinating across its various functions. And I think info security, since it affects everybody, is going to kind of show that up in the conversation.
Cool. All right, let's kick off. So to begin this, I did the obligatory search on the web for definition of info security. I found two which I thought were interesting. Wikipedia defines it as the practice of defending information from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, perusal, inspection, recording, and destruction. What I thought was interesting was the next definition I found on a website called techtarget.com. It's a set of business processes that protects information assets, regardless of how the information is formatted, or whether it's being processed, in transit, or being stored. The combination of these two definitions I thought was very interesting. When we think of info security, we immediately think of technology, but here's a definition by TechTarget that refers to this as a business process. And I think that's a very relevant point to bring up in this discussion, that I think it's that combination of technology and business processes. Again, this is my first salvo. I want everybody to either agree or disagree with me as we go through it, but that's my goal here, is to give you those first points. From a business case perspective, the obvious business case of protection, we know that. But if you see this here, you know, those who collect, store, transmit information are going to be subject to incredible pressures from regulation. Local, state, federal, regulatory, industry standards, etc. And the way it's worded here, to protect the public, right, by holding the financial institutions responsible for establishing, implementing, and supporting appropriate privacy and data security standards, and for mitigating the harm of any breach. So this is the expected behavior that regulators are going to impose on the financial institutions when it comes to info security. We know it's a challenge, but we're not going to get away with the accountability of protecting the asset, data, and protecting the public. What I propose to be the goal for this working group is to explore the nature of the collaborative relationship between data management officer and the Chief Information Officer, or the CDO and the CISO, or CISO. We're not replacing or saying that the Chief Data Officer is going to do things that the Security Officer is doing. We're not saying that. But there's got to be a tight relationship between the two, and that's my proposal to the group. What is that relationship? The question then is, if the CISO is charged with the responsibility of securing data, what's the role of the CDO? And to get us started, I propose a couple of separation or collaboration of duties, as I'm calling it. The CISO is clearly the person responsible for perimeter protection. Attacks from activists, organized crime, nation states, any of those external attacks against the perimeter. What we've seen an increase in is protecting internal attacks. I believe the suspicion was that the Sony attack from last year was actually an internal attack. So the CISO has their basket full, if you will, of things to do. But what is that collaborative relationship with the CDO? Creation of data inventory. I know for a fact one of our members experienced an exam, and they were told to make sure that they had a data inventory in support of their CISO's work. So data inventory is an important element. You know, what data do you have that needs to be protected? Further, is that data properly classified from a data sensitivity perspective, or privacy perspective? Are those classifications, quote unquote, metadata, assigned to those data so that it's obvious and aware, people are aware of its route? And then the concept of good old governance, policy, and standards, right? Control access through those policies, who has a right to get at data, who doesn't. All has to be done in collaboration with the Chief Information Security Officer.
John,
I would say that
sorry,
yes.
Can I interject at that point? I've got a couple of questions that have come up. First of all, Leslie, just release your line. Leslie McMonagle, can you be heard? Leslie from Protegrity?
Yeah.
Hi
Can
there.
you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Yep. Hi, Lizzie.
Yeah, so I would add defining information security policy under your responsibilities for CISO.
Hmm? What was it again? Hang on.
I've been the CISO for a credit card company and a bank in the past.
So the question was, John, who's responsible for policy on information security?
Good question. All right, so let me do this. Okay, so the question was, who is responsible for policy?
Yeah, information security policy. And Leslie was saying it was the CISO's function. So I think that was the thing he was trying to add was.
Got it. Okay. Let me just note that there for a second here. Just bear with me.
In the vast majority of organizations, that's going to be the CISO's role.
Okay, I'll just pose that as a as a question. Second here. Okay, good. Let me just throw this last slide out, and then we'll open it up for all the questions. The approach, based on what we just talked to you in that separation of duties, for this group is to look at best practices and adhering to industry standards. So what are those best practices? And I think as a group we need to research what those best practices are. And I think to the question that was just brought up, who's responsible for what? What are the industry standards that we're driving to align to? There definitely needs to be a holistic approach to this. It isn't just the security officer and the chief data officer. It's other control functions like privacy and cross-border have to be engaged. And I do have a question to the group. How, from a data engineering perspective, how should data be organized, stored, etc., in alignment with that info security requirement. So I just wanted to add that before we open it up, and let's then take that and go into the first questions. So the first question I'm going to pose to the entire group is, why are you here, basically, and what challenges are you facing with respect to not data governance, but with respect to info security and the role that the data office plays with info security? So the first one we had from Leslie, and that was who's responsible for the info security. Any other thoughts on this? What challenges are people seeing with respect to their role and how it plays in with the information officer, security information officer?
I have a
John,
comment.
it's Lisa.
Go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry.
Lisa. No, go ahead, Lisa.
It's Lisa Toth. I just wanted to, I guess, add a further comment in terms of who is responsible for the actual policy. I think the CISO's role is the implementation of the policy, but setting that policy actually should be done kind of at the governance level, pulling in kind of the key stakeholders so that it is kind of something that is embedded enterprise-wide, and then the CISO is empowered or, to actually then do the implementation.
So
it's who sets versus who implements.
Correct.
And where does the empowerment sit for problems, right?
Yep.
I think our biggest challenge is alignment. There are a lot of existing security policies that we already have, but they are not at all aligned to the governance program, because the governance program came in much later.
So pre-data governance, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So the question there would be what? How should that?
How do you now align that into a overall data governance objective if you already have pre-existing policies?
Yeah, normal best practice for information security policies in an organization would be to go through an annual review process where the policies are then updated and kept up to date with, changes in regulations, company culture, industry changes, and so on.
So wouldn't there be an already existing governance mechanism for the information security policies, even pre-data management? So I think really you're talking about how do you incorporate additional, so what's the real challenge there in your opinion?
A lot of it is just that we don't really have all of those well cataloged, and when you start looking at what the definitions of the data are that are under governance, they're not necessarily the same as what the governance program and the security policies program share. They're not talking about the same things.
Hi, this is Tim Oxborough here. I used to be Director of Info Risk, and I actually had the CISO reporting to me. I mean, usually it's the CISO that establishes what the policy is, and then it'll go through some kind of ratification program. I think the greatest challenge is how do you promulgate what the InfoSec requirements are, because the core piece, and you kind of talked about it, is the whole data classification and the whole question of structured versus unstructured data. And the way I approached it was through an EAB, an Enterprise Architecture Board. And you need to define what the data architecture is and then overlay onto it what the InfoSec requirements are. So if you're having very confidential data, okay, so what are the, first of all, where do we know where the data is? And then when we do, what are the policy requirements for protecting it? And info classification isn't just the kind of the confidentiality piece of it. It's also integrity and also availability. I mean, thinking here of disaster recovery. So if you have a data that needs very strict and robust RTOs and RPOs, recovery time and recovery point objectives, then the data architecture needs to reflect what mechanisms and protocols you're actually going to have in place to allow data recovery. I mean, that's InfoSec officer's perspective on life, and I don't know whether.
All right, let's make sure we capture all that. So John, here's what I heard. How do you promulgate the information security policies?
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with structured versus unstructured data? What is the role of data architecture in implementing the policy? And what types of classification do you have to consider, not just restrictions, but also recovery, if I heard those two distinctions correctly?
There are three elements to it. We always call it the CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Perfect.
Sorry,
That's captured.
who's this speaking?
Tim Oxborough.
Tim? Okay, Tim. So I think, did I capture those? You see the screen?
So John, if you wouldn't mind putting the types of classification, and Tim referred to that as CIA, which is
Confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Integrity and availability.
Integrity?
No.
Yeah, another important thing to consider is data security and privacy is just one of the main subject areas under data governance. You know, along with data quality and data integration and data ownership, you have to look at privacy and security as just one of the main subject areas that are part of data governance. The CISO at an organization should sit on that data, that higher level data governance steering committee at an organization. It's typical.
So data governance.
So really, it's elevating information security as part of a governance objective. How do you now do that in a environment where data is a new player? Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yes.
Listen, I want to make sure I capture that. So I think that's an important point, and I think that's the gist of what we want to do with this working group is how do these two roles collaborate together? And I think there's going to be a lot of this cross-pollination. So in a data governance program, there has to be a reference to info security and vice versa. So is that what I'm hearing, the need that within governance there's got to be call-outs for data info security, and within info security call-outs against data governance? Is that correct?
I like what Tim said earlier about the overlay of security on architecture. I think that's a great way to think about it.
So John, if you're elevating data as a governance objective, how do you incorporate these disparate activities into an overall governance mechanism, including architecture, classification, promulgation, review, etc.?
That's all of these here, right? Brought out. The role. So the question I have is the role of data governance defines policy and standard. Policy and standard would include access control, but is that already in place in a information officer's policy? Should they overlap? Should they be rewritten? Is that what I'm hearing?
Access typically is an InfoSec requirement, and it comes off the classification. And generally, the InfoSec will drive the entire IAM, Identity and Access Management Program.
Yeah, security would be the implementer and work with the data owners to implement the appropriate access controls. But the data owner has to define who gets access. CISO and the information security group would help them to enforce that.
That's a really important point. Who was that who was speaking?
This is Les McMonagle.
Unless I don't want to spell your name incorrectly. It's Ellie.
Yeah, LES, and then the last name McMonagle, McMonagle.
Ellie, got it. So let's.
The other areas that you'd want to think about under data governance is data architecture. We've already talked about data quality, and lineage, data integration, and the data flows between platforms, security and privacy we already mentioned, and then also metadata management and master data management.
This is Terry Nolan. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Terry.
I'm with Charles Schwab. I wanted to bring in a perspective. I'm a long-time data guy in security. One of the things that I'm finding is a significant difference between legacy data and greenfield data.
Terry, you are fading in and out. We're having really trouble hearing you. Sorry about that.
I'll see if I can do something. What I'm saying is there's a difference between legacy data and greenfield data that causes you to use security in a different way that needs to be understood. The comments that I'm hearing mostly around legacy data and data that's existed where data governance already has done.
Mike, I'm not picking it up.
I'm so terribly sorry, Terry. I can't hear you either. We'll have to maybe have you type that one in. I realize you're driving, but you're not at your office, but we can't hear you.
While we're waiting to see if we can do anything on the audio, I've actually got
Carol, if you just capture his name, we'll make sure we send him a note and capture the point so we at least can do that.
Absolutely, that's not a problem.
Folks, running out of space on the screen, I'm going to jump to the next screen and continue to take notes here. So
okay. There are a couple of other people who I think are wanting to say something. Peter Kapoor, you need to put in your audio pin so I can release your line. Otherwise, there's not a lot I can do to get your sound on. Andrew Chalmers, are you there? Can you be heard?
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Andrew.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. So one major issue that my firm has been facing recently, I work at Fannie Mae, so we have obviously more than 60% of the personally identifiable information with the United States, and so it's not a question of if we get attacked, but it's more like a question of how often and when. But for us, from a data governance perspective, one of the most recent topics that we've been facing is how do you use your data governance strategy to make sure that you codex the data correctly, but not only that you look at beyond what's required by the government laws on protection for personally identifiable information, but you also have to look at your trade secrets, for example. And as we start to implement new strategic initiatives, we also want to make sure that what we're documenting and defining in our bodies of work is accessible to the right groups of people. So we're starting to look a little closer at our policy on who has the right access to what you can use as a resource, and making sure that that's aligned to your user ID. That may change in the future, but I think that the codexing from a data governance strategy is critical.
So Andrew, how do you use data governance strategy to protect the data? Are you suggesting, and this is what I think I heard in the previous comments, that the definition is driven by data governance, the implementation is done by info security. So is part of the role then to define what those parameters are?
I don't have an answer for that, but I do know that we've come across instances where we have proprietary information that is fundamental to a definition. So our major issue was, well, if we're going to document this particular definition in our repositories, how do we control that that's going to stay internal to the company? How do we know that that information won't get transferred out during a strategic initiative where we're working with Freddie Mac, for example, because we have a combined securitization platform? So there's
great new subject, John. I'm sorry, let me just make sure we capture that. So if I hear, Andrew, you correctly, you have your own trade secrets and your own proprietary information, and you want to make sure that your valuable intellectual property is protected, particularly when you are sharing with your partners. How do you protect your own proprietary information, make sure that the right people have access to it, that they're not compromising your value proposition?
Exactly, exactly. And a case point example of this is pricing. I mean, pricing in and of itself needs to be protected from two different departments. You'll have an independent pricing verification department as well as the pricing folks that set up the models. And that's just within the firm where you have to keep the information separate. Otherwise, you have a conflict of information security where somebody can take advantage of an internal situation. But that also extends to outside the firm. If you collaborate with larger organizations like security depository institutions, you don't want to share any of that information with the market. You have to be very strategic about how you control it. So we don't have a solution yet, but I would like to pose that as a question to the group to see if anybody has experience dealing with that kind of data management.
Particularly in a world of increasing transparency and even increasing regulatory transparency, you do have to protect your own customers' positions, your methodologies, the things that distinguish you as a financial organization.
But Andrew, let me challenge that. Just not challenge it, but let me just ask this question: Why is that different from securing other types of data?
So I think that there's two sides to the data, right? There's internal use and external use. So in the financial world, I think that securing the data to make sure that external attackers can't get access to it is critical, of course, right? Protecting your non-public information or personally identifiable information. But from internal use, though, you have A, laws that guide how you handle that data and making sure that it stays separated. But B, you also don't want people leaving the firm with that knowledge capital if they shouldn't have access to it in the first place. So
when I suggested the role of the CHISO secret, right, the perimeter protection, but then there's the internal responsibility. Is that the same thing?
I would say
it's not an attack,
there's elements
John.
on both. Go ahead, sorry.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Andrew. I'm not hearing an attack. I'm hearing you have valuable property. How do you protect it? It's the role of protecting it from unauthorized distribution outside your organization, or even leaving out the door when a new employee comes in.
So that was what I was capturing here. The idea of device protection. People can't walk out with thumb drives. The Sony attack was an internal.
No, John. No. I mean, Andrew is making a point that usually the data that is related to like your products, financial products, pricing, etc., gets forgotten. I mean, the whole effort is focused on client data, on transaction data, etc. And some of the very sensitive data that is really a trade secret for the firm is not considered as the part of that. An attack can be internal or external, by the way.
Yeah, that's what I
guys. I would like to interject on something. This is
This is a scope issue. Go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead. Who's speaking?
Yeah, this is Justin Heller speaking. Let me just share a little bit of how we're philosophically looking at it, right? So information security and physical security, in the case of fraud, and my organization have partnered jointly. And so they look at it very broadly in terms of threat detection and prevention, right? And in order to detect threats, in order to prevent threats, it relies on the organization defining what are the critical business processes that are worth protecting, and those, as well as all the assets. And those are physical assets, including buildings, right? People, processes, systems, infrastructure, and data. And this is where the role of data governance comes in, right? Because there are two things going on. One is, how do you properly categorize and classify not only those assets, but being able to, and I think this is what Andrew was talking about, being able to bring that classification down to a data domain level, and even potentially a data element or data attribute level. And so this is where the partnership between, I think, the CISO and the CDO comes in, is they both have responsibilities to ensure that that the inherent risks to our assets are understood and properly tagged. Information security is looking at it at a higher level of granularity in many cases because they're largely focusing on process and infrastructure, whereas the CDO is generally looking at content as well. And so getting back to, again, Andrew's point around proper, what we call them, privacy categories, right? Is it SPII? Is it confidential? Is it internal? Is it restricted? Right? Those are the things that I heard Andrew talk about, right? Some internal trade secret data may be restricted access, right? Being able to tag our information, tag these assets, both say what is the infrastructure classification, what is the process classification, what is the data content privacy classification. That partnership is really intended to enable both the CISO and the CDO to drive forward their agendas in terms of implementation. Remember, the CISO is implementing ways to prevent risks, threats, right, to the organization. The CDO is looking to implement how do you identify inherent risk that data can cause to a business process. And so, you know, you do have two different policies. They do overlap in one area, which is how do you categorize and classify information. Therefore, both have to have a common taxonomy to talk about these things. Right? But fundamentally, I think the way to look at this, it's about preventing and detecting risks, and the CDO and CISO focus on different risks, but through a common taxonomy of process and assets.
Okay, so John, I captured some of that, and you've been typing, but your stuff's not showing up on your screen. So maybe you could refresh your screen just to make sure that what you tagged is caught.
What do you mean it's not showing up?
You're typing, but there's nothing showing up on your screen. Does anybody else
we
see
said
that
as far as the
problem?
last point being classification of assets are properly tagged.
Okay, that's what I wrote. So,
right. But keep in mind, there are different assets involved, right?
Yeah.
I think taxonomy, right?
Well, let's make sure we captured this. This is I think really important, right? So if I hear you correctly, there are many assets: systems, data, infrastructure, and physical.
thank you.
The CISO is usually responsible for the processes and the infrastructure types. The CDO is now increasingly responsible for the content. Both of those are brought together by classification, tagging, understanding and tagging.
Right.
And the requirement in order to do that is a common language between common taxonomies about processes and data.
That's right.
Right. So again, it goes back to the CDO, that separation of duty, right? The CDO in establishing policy and standards and establishing a policy standard around metadata ensures that proper classifications of the assets are achieved, right? Whether it's privacy, whether it's trade secret data, etc.
That's right.
Implementation of protection around that is not the CDO's responsibility. That then falls to the science of info security, which is the responsibility of the CISO. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Security officer would be responsible.
Again, but I would encourage that the thought process be one around the roles as it relates to detecting and preventing inherent risk, right? Because at the end of the day, right, the CDO has to enable the CISO to meet his objectives, right? And it's very hard to protect assets if you don't have them categorized to begin with, let alone can you trust the categorization. And that's where the governance piece comes in, is that there's accountability to ensure that the content that's used to enforce protection or minimally detection can be trusted like any other data.
And that's driven by what, Justin? That's, again, driven by adherence to the internal policies defined by the chief data officer across the organization, that data is then, so if properly tagged, then the consequence of the tagging should be properly applied, right? If it's privacy, it's treated this way. If it's trade secrets, it's treated a certain way. Or data in motion, it has to be encrypted if properly tagged, etc.
Right.
That's what I would say is the kind of the relationship between the two at the higher level.
Just one additional point, John. I think if I hear correctly, the role of governance, in order to trust the classification and to promulgate a shared language across the participants, needs to be understood, because that's your framework for making sure that roles, types, levels are organizational, are understood by the whole organization.
So with that, I mean, just capture real quick, to drive common language, to drive appropriate action, drive and ensure that appropriate actions are taken, right?
And don't forget do you trust the classification, right? So, if it is classified correctly, how do you ensure that it's classified correctly across all these various?
That's the role of the, okay, so I'll capture it. That's the role of the chief data officer, right?
Well,
Right.
that's fine.
Yeah, an organization would have, one of their security policies would be a data classification policy that describes different categories of data and then the types of protection, the authentication and access controls and accountability that would have to be applied to each of those, whether it's intellectual property like trade secrets and pricing information, or it's personally identifiable information like, customers' names and contact information and so on.
Yeah. You were fading in and out, but I think I caught that. The importance of the proper classification, and then the actions that have to be taken when the classifications are identified, are again that overlap between the CHSL and the CDO. Yeah, again, if we think about the scope of this work group, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, forgive me. To what do we want to see this group produce? I think what I'm hearing is, now I can tell you what came out of our past discussion, and people are talking about identifying a playbook or a list of best practices on data governance. This, I think, is a little bit different. I think what we need here is clarity of definition. I think is one of the things we have to define. And some guidance around how the two roles overlap. Is that? I mean, I'm just throwing that out now as a proposal. What do we expect this group to define with respect to info security, CDO, and the CHSL?
To me, it's very much a partnership. And interesting, if you look at, you have data management and information security. I mean, InfoSec is all about the information and how are we going to protect it from a CIA perspective.
So I wrote down the same thing. The nature of the collaboration between information security and data seems to be what everything can kind of be linked under.
So we don't have any standards right now for what that collaboration is. Should that be one of the focuses of this group?
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think if the group can come up with a clear consensus on what the roles and responsibilities are between the chief data officer versus the chief information security officer versus the chief security officer and other stakeholders, I think that would be very, very valuable.
I think that might be challenging because each organization may have nuances around the scope of both roles remits within the company. But maybe if we were to take this rather than roles and responsibilities and look at it in terms of what is an operating model, right?
Hmm.
You sort of take a look at the DCAM, and I know that in information security, there's a similar kind of capabilities model as well. I'm not sure if it's NIST or something else, but maybe this is starting as a mapping between two capability models that are out there to see where the overlaps are, right? Because the roles may be different.
Do people, anybody on the call know what that standard is?
There is actually an ISO. There's ISO 27000, which is on InfoSec. Other ones which are often used, people had
One more zero, John. 27,000.
Well, yeah, it's the 27,000 series because it covers 27,001 and 2, find what policies you should have and how you implement. 27,004 is about metrics to use for measuring, the efficacy of your security program. So the 27,000 series is the best way to define it.
Got it. Okay, but is there an operating model, standard operating model for?
Yeah. For risk assessments, there is. It's Lisa. It's the FFIEC, Cybersecurity Risk Assessment Model.
FSIEC, cybersecurity?
Yeah, FFIEC. You've got EIC, FFIEC, Cybersecurity Risk Assessment Model.
That's just John being dyslexic, so.
Okay.
That was just me and my fingers not working.
You're going to find there's a lot more mature documentations and standards around information security because it's been around longer. The role of
That's right.
officer is a lot newer.
But the key thing I heard was the integrating. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, John, just to interrupt. Does anybody know of the data equivalent of the FFIEC information security type? Have you seen anything similar from a data perspective, or is that the gap that needs to be filled?
Mike, I think that's the role that the DCAM is effectively playing. Right? Because I think the nearest thing that we have that prescribes standards is BCBS 239, which talks about expectations around capabilities. I just think, to the point that was just made, the information security discipline has been around much longer, and therefore these standards emerged much faster.
They're more mature. They're just more mature.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
that FFIEC Cybersecurity Risk Assessment Model is very similar to DCAM in terms of how it's laid out, how you respond to it.
Oh, good. Then combining it might be a little easier then.
Yeah.
Or at a minimum, creating an operating model that connects them, because I think that gives a really good roadmap that people in each organization can pick and choose where they want to implement their program. Because you can start at this at any point, right? Everyone's at a different maturity level. Same thing's going to be true between the information security and the data governance maturity levels. They'll be entering at different points. And so each company may need the flexibility to figure out where do they want to start within a common operating model.
So, John, would you mind capturing the connection between FFIEC and DCAM and BCBS 239? Because I think that all of those have various components that we can.
Well, that's what I did, Mike. I don't know if you're seeing my screen, but I captured Lisa's comment about the FFIEC, and then what I heard was
DCAM role.
the DCAM role, but it's filling the gap, right? Integrating the cybersecurity standards that are out there, robust, into the data management operate model, governance standards, etc. That seems to be the missing link right now. Is that correct?
Do also remember that the FFIEC is just the US and it's just for the finance industry. Now, which isn't to say that it isn't important, but we might need to be a little bit careful if we draw too heavily on one geography's regulations for one industry group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a valid point. Make sure it's extended globally, John. Let's not be too U.S. centric. I think is the only caution there.
Yeah, but it's based on NIST, the NIST framework.
Yeah.
And a lot of countries have actually kind of adopted the NIST framework in terms of, what recommended frameworks you should be using. And IOSCO just came out with a report on April 6th that went over some of the kind of country by country, the regulatory initiatives that are in place for cybersecurity. And in that report, IOSCO comes out very heavily leaning on the NIST framework.
So Lisa, so John, it's based on the NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology framework.
That's what I'm looking for. Thank you. Okay.
Cybersecurity framework.
And then it's only one S in IOSCO. And Lisa, do you know what that report was?
Yeah, I'll chat Carol the link to it, but it was essentially, I think it was called the IOSCO regulatory report on the securities market, a global perspective or something like that. But if you go to their website, it's on the right-hand side under reports, and it was issued on April 6th.
April 6th, that's the key, Dear John. That's captured.
Is that the link you've just fired to me, Lisa?
No, that was for the FFIE risk assessment model, but I'm going to send you the link to the report.
So this is really important, and this is what I was hoping we would get to. That I know there's stuff out, and
the NIST framework, John, not the NIST standards. NIST framework is what we were.
Right. So I'm not an expert in it. The idea is that we want to capture that, and make sure that that's an integral part of your data management strategy. So for me, as a former CDO, I would want to see what would be helpful to me would be. This is how you should effectively operate with your information security officer with respect to your program and data management. My data management program has to be aligned to those things, and this is kind of the playbook and the best practices and the alignment to industry standard that would be my responsibility to drive the data management program to be in alignment with the CHISA program, and I think that's what I'm hearing is kind of one of the outcomes we'd like to get out of this.
I'd like to also get back to the comment about common taxonomy or language between the CHISO and the CDO. Because, John, when we did this for data quality, what came out was a ways for everybody to talk about the components of quality, which proved to be very useful. And I'm wondering whether that same language about all of the components of information security is part of this playbook that you're talking about.
I don't see any reason how you couldn't, how you could do this without it, right? So you need a common language, so the info security and data people are talking the same thing. There's going to be gaps that we identified. Perhaps within the operate model, within the data management operate model, that need to be captured. They might even be a little bit back the other way. We have to have trust and faith in how things are classified and processes around those classifications so that they're constantly maintained and up to date. And we have to have assurance that appropriate actions are taken when a particular classification is identified with respect to how that data is treated, if it's encrypted, what type of secure lines it needs to be transmitted over, etc. The CDO is not responsible for the physical transfer, the physical lines, but they have to work with info security and technology and make sure that that's implemented. So a lot of overlap, I think. What we lack, I think, is any kind of a document that says this is the best practices. And I think that's the objective of the group. Unless people have other suggestions on what we'd like to accomplish, I'd like to pose that as kind of at least a stake in the ground of what the group would try to accomplish. And any comment on that?
It can change because you will find some ISOs are more kind of policy focused, saying, okay, this is how we need to classify data, and if it's this, you have to do that, blah, blah, blah. And then pretty much leave it to others for the execution. There are other groups where the ISO would actually own, for instance, any of the encryption, and they would be responsible for going out and looking at which encryption tools you couldn't apply to Oracle and blah, blah, blah. So coming up with a one-size-fits-all might not work because organizations have different cultures and different approaches to the role and responsibility of the ISO. Are they more direction or execution or operation?
I agree with that 100%. What you need to define, though, is what are the different functions and responsibilities that have to be dealt with. And a CDO would look at it and say, okay, which are my responsibility in my organization and which ones would fall under the CISO on how we've set up our organization. But it's important to have that list so that nothing is being missed. Nobody's assuming that it's somebody else's job to look after things like data classification or whatever it might be. Those things are listed and that they have to be assigned to somebody, and there will be that gray area in the middle where, just as you said, some CISOs have operational responsibility for information security. They manage user provisioning and all sorts of things. In other organizations, they're purely a standards and policy type of role where they have virtually no staff, and their job is just to define policy and not to do the implementation or the auditing or anything like that.
So John, I heard a definition of the functions and responsibilities without regard to who does them as a kind of important foundational thing.
So define the
functions and responsibilities.
How about roles and responsibilities? The racing matrix. Because there's going to be different roles.
I guess it doesn't matter what you call it, but it's important that all the different tasks that would need to be done and things that if they're left out are going to cause problems, that they're all listed and they're addressed or put under somebody's umbrella to be responsible for.
Yeah, so just to make it broad, John, functions, roles, and responsibilities is what the discussion was. Yep, thank you.
But what I would say is that in any guideline, you never want to be overly prescriptive, because then you will disenfranchise or turn people off, whatever it might be. The guidelines should be broad enough yet specific enough. So capture the functions. Suggested roles and responsibilities might be okay to do, but you don't want to be, like I said, too definite, because it'll vary from firm to firm. Right?
Correct. The functions exist. Who does them might vary.
All right. So is the goal then to create a I guess I'll summarize this from the conversation, because I'm just conscious of the fact we only have 4 minutes left. But it sounds like what we want to do here is definitely identify these standards that are out there, get a better awareness of what they are, align them to what the role of the chief data officer is and the role of data management, and then produce a guideline or I don't know if it's a playbook or guidelines or whatever on how the two roles should interact, or
it's a chapter in DCAM, John. Of course it is.
Well, I got it here, right? It's I want to be getting into DCAM. I think what I heard is what we've captured. Let me know if I missed anything, at least in these notes, and certainly again, this is dynamic, right? So people can send me emails. I capture all the information. We'll put it together. Now, in the last few minutes, I do want to talk about how we should operate the group. We've got a lot of people on the call. It's great to have them. What I will propose to the group is, as we start to define these different elements of this topic, would it make sense to break it into separate groups, smaller groups? Maybe one group would focus on that, the NIST standard, another group would focus on the DCAM interaction, overlap or whatever, break it into separate subgroups and then bring them together. Would that work for this group, do you think?
Yes.
I think that once you sort it out, John, that is absolutely what you're going to wind up doing. There's probably a little bit of sorting it out still to do.
Right, and once we do that, hopefully people would be interested in maybe leading a subgroup to drive some of that and bring that together. Would people be? I know it takes people's time to do this, but if someone would be interested, or people would be interested to take a kind of a subcommittee role to drive it, that would be very helpful.
Hey, John,
in general,
just as a thought before we get to that point, maybe what we should do is summarize this in terms of the outcomes that we're looking to achieve, and then see if there are common themes in those outcomes that can be grouped, that could be used to set up those different committees or subgroups that you're talking about. I think let's get everyone's on the same page as to what are those outcomes. We're probably going to see a set of common outcomes, and then you're going to inevitably see things that may be on the fringe because they're very specific to what each organization is trying to do, and maybe the first pass at it is the common outcomes to drive it from that perspective, just as a thought.
No, I think that's excellent.
You want the outcomes of those subgroups to all have a similar format and things like that.
Yeah, part of that coordination will fall to me in terms of, I'll call it the project manager, if you will, making sure the subgroups, once defined, it all comes together at the end, right? But I agree, that's part of what I've got to do based on this feedback, and again, additional feedback if people want to send me emails to come up with those common themes. I think that's exactly what we need to do. Once we get those common themes, I'll propose 3 or 4 of them, whatever they might be, see if we all agree on them, and then we can start to break it into subgroups and sub-responsibilities.
Perfect.
And John, sorry, it's Lisa again. I think, too, a critical element here is also keeping an eye on what's happening on the regulatory front from a cybersecurity perspective, because this will influence what firms are mandated to do, both in terms, in terms of protecting client data or the firm's information.
I think that's go ahead.
But it isn't just InfoSec. If you look at the EU, they're passing some very new strict data privacy requirements, and they're carving out a role for the chief data officer. So that's a real big area that we need to be thinking of.
Are they actually explicitly saying that it's the responsibility falls to the CDO, or is that how it
I would have to recheck that up. I was reading the article and I think, that's going to be interesting, because Europe's had some pretty strict data privacy rules for 30 years. They're just ramping them up. I'll quite happily take the lead on the privacy requirements if you wish.
Yes, absolutely.
So, John, I hear just beyond information security, we have to keep our eye on privacy and business sensitivity.
Well, privacy, fraud, right? You called it business sensitivity?
Well, we certainly understand the information security side, the cyber threat. I think clearly now we're talking also the privacy restrictions. Yeah. But earlier, the Fannie Mae conversation was about on protecting your own information assets. So I think those are three themes I've heard.
Hi, this is Barbara Geschwin with Lockheed Martin. I'd like to add to the list that we should look at NIST Special Publication 800-53, which lists information security controls. And they're broken into categories like access controls or network controls. What would be really nice if this group could develop a set of data controls, because they're not detailed in the areas of data. So we could amend DCAM. We could also amend a standard like NIST 853 or ISO 27001. They're both very closely related. And those categories, the categories of information security, they're identified. We could also take each category and write guidelines or notes specific to data within those. Just two ideas for how we could integrate.
Who is that speaking?
Excuse me? Oh, Barbara Geschwind with Lockheed Martin.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay, we're a little bit over the time. Folks, thank you very much for your contributions here. This is going to continue on. We're going to have, I've got some summarization work to do. I will get notes out to you again. Bear with me as I finish some of my travel. It might be a couple of weeks before this is we regroup. But keep the comments coming. I'm going to capture them. Mike, you've also helped me capture the notes. We'll get our heads together, come up with some summaries, and get it out to the group.
Thank you, John. Really nicely done. Really interesting.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.
All right, man.
All right. Bye.